We're going to start off less than 30 seconds. Each one of us, name, rank, serial number. Obviously, if you want to, learn anything more about any of us, we're on LinkedIn, what have you. So no commercials, please. Lucas, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Hey, everybody. Lucas Hartwich with Green Street. Green Street's a leading independent real estate research firm, and I manage our healthcare and lodging coverage.
Great. Thank you. Ronnie?
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Ronnie Garbier, and I oversee development and acquisitions for Pod Hotels. It's a compact room brand. We have about 5 hotels and 2,000 rooms. We're part of BD Hotels, a large hotel owner in New York for about 30 hotels and 2.5 billion asset under management.
Thank you. Thank you. Ed Blum.
Hi, Dan. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for having me this afternoon. I appreciate it. Ed Blum. I'm the Executive Vice President of Acquisitions and Development for Ambridge Hospitality. We manage about 1,500 hotels in 49 states and over 20 countries. I also have the pleasure of co-chairing with my friend Mark LeBlanc, Ambridge Receivership Services.
Thank you, Ed. And last but not least, Russ.
Hi, Russ Flicker. I'm the managing partner of AWH Partners. We're an owner, operator, developer of hotels across the country with about 7,000 keys today.
Great, thank you. So the title of our discussion is Distressed Opportunities in the Hotel Sector. Before we get into the Q&A, I think it's important just to sort of set a backdrop. This is an audience that includes folks that don't necessarily play in the hotel space every day. What I'm about to talk about is nothing new. It's pretty logical, but just again, setting a backdrop that, hotels, when you compare them to other commercial real estate asset classes, are very, very different. They really are going concern business operations married up with bricks and mortar real estate. And the fact is that there are no long-term tenancies, credit tenancies, no less, in a hotel, right? You're leasing up guest rooms every single night. With technology being what it is, the pricing of guest rooms literally changes by the nanosecond. In an up market, that's a beautiful thing. In a down market, it'll kill you, just like we've experienced these, past couple of months. And if you think about full service hotels, selling food and beverage and recreational opportunities, right? And then the expenses associated with those different income streams, that's very, very different than putting heads in beds. So it's a complicated business housed in real estate, high fixed costs, high labor costs. There's all sorts of compounded complexity vis-a-vis. You have debt, equity, management company, brand. You have all these different constituents that, very often their objectives are not aligned. So that creates quite a bit of complexity. And the last thing I would just throw out there again as a backdrop is that there's a fair amount of reliance on intermediaries, namely airlines, right? If the airlines aren't going, you're not putting heads in beds, right? Think about hotels on island locations, right? So with that as a backdrop, why don't we start? And I know this is New York centric, and we're going to talk about New York, but it's important to start sort of at 30,000 feet about the lodging sector. So this one I'd like to pose to everybody on the panel. The reality is that this past year has clearly been a game-changing period for the world, for the United States, for the global lodging industry. Clearly an inflection point, if you will. And when life returns to a stabilization, right? Here's the question. Are we going to return to normal or new normal? Why don't we go the other way around? Russ.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think we certainly are going to return to a new normal. I think there are certainly times when you overestimate how much the change is. And so the change is on the margins, but when you have this many marginal changes happen, and also what's happened is sped up existing trends, some of those things will seem very different. One that comes off the top of my head is technology and the use in hotels already happening. There was already a movement to contactless check-in and using your key, digital key, and things like that. I do think not only has that sped up what was already happening, but I think you can almost play a game where you think about the hotel of the future and what would it be 100 years from now. Some of that's going to be happening in the next 10 years, and that is, again, a movement away from the interaction in a lot of places. The other thing I'll throw out there is I think because of the pandemic, you're going to see a number of changes. Again, these are other changes that were already trends that were already happening, but the satellization of offices and the work from vacation or work from away will, I think, continue. Those are two trends that will really benefit the hotel business, leading to more, I believe, corporate transient travel over time. But again, those are things that will continue. There might be marginal changes, but they'll have a big impact.
Thank you. Ed.
I think, Dan, it's both a combination of the normal and the new normal. Let's talk about the normal for a moment. We've been hearing, Dan, and guys like you and I have been around for a long time, we've been hearing the hotel world is dead. Hotels, people are going to use teleconferencing. So hotels will be just like the dinosaur. One thing we've seen and we'll continue to see is pent-up demand for hotel travel. So hotels in the normal, hotels will continue to be an important part, whether it's for leisure travel, for business travel. I personally can't wait to get back on the road every week and see my friends, see guys like you, guys like Russ, guys like Lucas, like Ronnie, and have conversations. But it's also a new normal. Let's talk about cleanliness. A clean room is just not enough anymore. Guests expect now outward signs of cleanliness. They want to make sure these rooms are clean. Let's talk a little bit about group business. You're not going to have these 2,000 person. Right now, we all would be in LA. All of us folks in hotel world would be in Los Angeles at the Alice conference. We're not there right now. But right away, we're not going to have big group conferences. We're going to have hybrid meetings. And then listen, to Russ's point, digital first. You're going to have requesting services, managing check-in, managing check-out, you name it. And then the last point that I touched on, the new normal, is food and beverage. If you think the breakfast buffet that we've been seeing for the last 20 years is going to come back like the way it's been, not going to happen. Everything is going to change. So it's both, Dan, it's the normal and the new normal.
Great. Ronnie?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Look, I agree with both Russ and Ed. I think it's a very much of an opinion piece here, but there is a leisure demand that is pent up based on the fact that everybody is very thirsty for human connection, and that probably going to be the first one to come back. And another piece as well that is pretty controversial is that convention business. Maybe convention business would take a little bit longer to come back, but if anything that change in corporate travel will indicate is that maybe people would want to congregate 2-3 years from now when it's safe to catch up and compensate for a little bit of reduction of corporate travel. As to permanent changes, in my opinion, I think there is an argument around a reduction in corporate travel, and let's just remember that it's the most lucrative segment in filling up our hotels. To what extent, God knows, right? You have the Bill Gates of this world on one spectrum, and the others on the other side. But one thing is for sure is that I had maybe 2 or 3 virtual video calls in 2019, and I had about 400 to 500 in 2020. Which one is actually going to be permanent? I think probably somewhere within that bracket. And in terms of priority, I'll be traveling to meet folks like you, acquire new businesses, meet new partners, get liked and like new people that I haven't met before. But maybe there'll be a reduction of travel around internal or repeat business or repeat markets. So it's a space to watch. But I think that there'll be a permanent change on the corporate side and maybe a compensation on the leisure side.
Well, I appreciate your comments and definitely take them to heart. With that being said, I have the highest level of respect for Bill Gates, and he knows what he knows. Apparently, he doesn't know what he doesn't know. He's not an expert on travel. And so, him coming out with the comment that he did, I think was a tad reckless because it's based on what? In any event, Lucas.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just emphasize a couple of the points brought up. I think the most interesting question over the next few years is how demand patterns are going to change as a result of two trends that we're not really sure how pervasive they'll be, but it's the work from home trend, right? Less office space, does that result in increased business travel? I think there's a prospect for that. But then also Zoom. I do think that Zoom and other forms of technological devices and whatnot I think we've all been surprised at how effective they've been. And yeah, it's not going to replace travel by any means, but I think it's hard to argue it's not going to take some share. And everyone's kind of guessing as to what share that will be. And, I think we'll dive into it a little bit deeper later on, but I think that's a really important question to kind of answer. So I think those are kind of the two variables that I'm most focused on over the next few years.
It's interesting, video conferencing and touchless key entry into guest rooms. That stuff's been around for quite some time now, and it's only come into the fore due to a pandemic, right? Skype has been around for 10 years. So it is interesting that all of a sudden now it's considered to be, the latest and greatest and something new, because it's really not something new. The fact that the brands reserved keyless entry for only their elite frequent travelers, I never really understood that. Right now, everybody's going to get it. If you don't provide it, you're not going to be able to compete. Let's talk about your point of view in terms of recovery timeline. What's the recovery going to look like for different hotel property types, independents, brands, luxury, resorts? Ronnie, why don't you take a stab at that?
Sure. Look, I think that we are onto a recovery path, which is already a very, very good thing, right? So that's positive. Everybody has a smile on. Investor sentiment is coming back. So from that perspective, we're in a good place, right? The problem is that it's not an on and off switch, and there's a lot of uncertainties as to when things will go back to normal. And if you were to peg the recovery to the therapeutics or the cure aspect of things, you could easily add 6 months to each phase, administration and traveler confidence and this and that. And that could easily get you to a normal pace that will resume in a couple of years. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't be having demand until then, but that may take a little bit longer to get to a good place. As to so I'm optimistic, cautious about the timeline, particularly when we have a lot of hotels that are bleeding, and so we need to stabilize the ship and be pragmatic as to how fast things will go back to normal. And as well, we're looking to acquire hotels, same thing. We need to be very pragmatic about the cash burn and the carry burden that we need to factor into our valuation, right? As to the product recovery, look, I think we're probably all in agreement that leisure seems to be at the far front of recovery. The segment within leisure that would recover faster might be the youth, because they were less vulnerable to the disease, and that plays good for folks that are playing in that space. For us, particularly pod hotels, 50% of our demand is below 35 years old, so we'd probably be a beneficiary of that. But I think in terms of convention hotels, that would be probably at the end, but we don't think we believe that segment is there to stay. And corporate is a question mark again. And I agree with you about Bill Gates, extreme spectrum. There's an interesting survey from Morgan Stanley, annual survey last year that came out. They interviewed travel managers of big corporations, and what came out is that 1 out of 5 meetings will be permanently virtual, at least in the foreseeable future. So that gives you a little bit of a more modest drop in corporate demand that seems to be reasonable. So hotels and products that are geared towards that segment heavily probably will be the lowest in recovery. And that priority from leisure, drive to destination, short flight to versus convention and very heavy corporate seems to be echoed by by investors, partners of ours, as we're looking at new deals.
Lucas, do you want to weigh in on what you think the recovery is going to look like if it's different than what Ronnie just articulated?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's important to maybe just start with some context. So I think peak to trough in this downturn, hotels will see well over 100% decline in NOI, which is really unprecedented. I know that term's been thrown around a lot, and I think in the case of the lodging industry, I think it's a very warranted term. I think it's not being misused in the case of the sector. So, well over 100% decline peak to trough. To give some context, the prior two downturns, those declines were more like 30 to 40%. So you can see we're talking orders of magnitude more challenging. So we're in a much deeper hole. So that's step one. But maybe more on the optimistic side, at Green Street, we actually think that the recovery will be faster than the last two downturns. So we think, to give you some numbers to kind of circle, we think in 2022, for example, NOI will be back to about 80% of where it was before COVID hit. And that's a faster recovery than what we experienced the last two times around. And then maybe just lastly, I'll just say that, while we think the recovery will be faster, it's going to take us some time to get back to where we were, right? We've dug a pretty deep hole, and yes, the recovery coming out we'll have some eye-popping growth numbers, but we don't think we'll hit new highs for the average property until the mid-2020s. So a very challenging near term, but we see the light at the end of the tunnel, and yes, we're gonna have some positive growth coming out of this, but it's gonna take us some time to get back to where we were.
It's interesting. Obviously 19 was a record year. January and February of 2020 ended up with new records as well. But 18 was a record. 17 was a record also, right? So, the notion of getting back to 19 all-time highs, is sort of, if you got back to 18 or 17, it's not so bad either, right? Everything's relative in life. Russ, why don't you comment on how you see the economics of hotel operations returning on a stabilized basis once COVID is beyond the rearview mirror?
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear if Ed agrees with the following, but I'll tell you, we are definitely going to be looking at, no one is going to be rushing to staff up again, right? So we're all focused on NOI, not RevPAR. And so if we can, we're all at these really lean levels. We've had conversations, if you're talking about branded hotels, the brands have been, fairly cooperative, but even before they came out with things, we were all taking actions in the pandemic to sort of manage that. And I think we're loath to staff up for what we hope is an upside in the future. And really we're going to stay, lean. And then you add in and layer in things about, for example, the buffet breakfast or other things, other services that are at best not required now, or at worst gray as you proceed and things start ramping up. So I think I imagine the entire industry will be running leaner with a goal of maximizing profitability every last dollar as we ramp up. I'll throw out there, Dan, just because I can't resist. Sounds like I'm the optimist on the panel. I remember in 2009 and 10, people told me it was never going to be the same. This is different than that. I totally acknowledge that. But there was a lot of smart people were certain that things had changed forever in dramatic ways. And so, I'm very bullish on the hotel industry. We've had 50 years of more spending on kind of discretionary spend. And for sure, as we're going up, we're going to be ramping up. It's going to take a while. Short term, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, absolutely is going to take some time. But if you ask me, 2024, 2025, will corporate group be back? Yes, I think so. And will it be different, and there'll be marginal changes, but they'll be made up by other things. The question for us is just, can we have, can twice the number of wedding groups over the next 18 months help soften the blow of no more groups? Because I think, and I say this teasingly, and I'm picking on you, but Morgan Stanley might believe that today, but I'm not sure they're right. And by the way, if Goldman goes to visit their clients in China and Morgan Stanley doesn't, they're going to be sorry. So I think of it in those terms, that short term, it's going to be a problem, but you know, the incremental person will go out and visit clients, and ultimately that leads me to some bullishness, even though there are definitely big macro trends that I think will be at play also. So I'm sorry to ramble.
No. Appreciate it. My friend Ed Blum hasn't had a chance to weigh in here, but I know him well, and he's the ultimate optimist. So, Ed, all this negativity that we hear and read about, right? We're hospitality folks, everybody on this line, right? And if you think about it, hospitality and negativity don't really marry up too well, right? So, Ed, give us some cheer.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm gonna tell Russ he's not the only negative guy on the panel. I'm not Dr. Doom and Gloom either. I mean, nor do I think it's Dan, nor Ronnie, nor Lucas. I think it's the hospitality industry, and we all feel good about it. So first of all, to Russ's point, we had 10 great years from the last 10 years, and Lucas can give some stats on it, but 10 years in a row of performance. So what does that mean? That means expense creep. It comes from the brands. Sadly, comes from the managers, comes from the owners, comes all around. What this has done, the pandemic is given all of us, let me rephrase that, it's forced all of us to take a look back, and there's been some great ingenuity, how we do things. And Russ, to your point, we don't want to go back to the way it's always been done. We want to re-examine every line item on the financial statement, staffing, processes, how we do things. I talked to our guys at our company, and they're thinking about things, and not just digital, thinking about how to do everything creatively. So it really is a new paradigm, how to operate hotels. And I think the future is very bright for the industry. And to Lucas's point, I think it's going to recover, quicker than we all expect. I mean, maybe, some of our big box hotels in major markets may take a little longer to recover, but I think the industry will do fine. First of all, I think all of us collectively need to do a shout out to the frontline workers industry who've come to work every day during this pandemic. I mean, talking about, the stars of our industry, these guys have come to work every day during the pandemic. They've been great stars to our guests, and we all need to thank them. But we also have seen some great signs. I mean, this summer, for many of us, we saw great numbers on our leisure transient business. I mean, some of our hotels, whether it be beachside resorts, hotels by national parks, even in some urban environments, the great numbers drive to leisure. People don't want to be in their homes. They want to travel. They want to see. And to your point, Russ, I mean, I disagree with all these industry experts. Look, we did a pitch recently for a project. There were 4 of us involved in the pitch. 3 of us, including ourselves, showed up at the owner's office and did the pitch. 1 person didn't. Guess who wasn't even considered for that project? The guy who didn't show up. We're still an industry where people want to see each other. They want to communicate. And look, some of our verticals in our business did phenomenal. People are looking for a little more space, like extended stay did great this summer. So look, I'm the Dan, you've known me for a long time. I'm the ultimate optimist. It's going to be a great industry. And I think the thing we have is we have a hospitality environment. We have great employees. And as long as we continue to reinvent ourselves, we'll do great.
You know what, Ed, if you don't make it in the hotel business, you'd make a great lobbyist. Ed, we've heard, a lot about distress, and more distress, and all these opportunities that are going to come around, right? We really haven't seen them. Can you comment on that a little bit?
No, I'd be happy to. So probably like some of the other guys in this panel, I get calls from our capital partners all day. Where is the distress? There is so much dry powder by the sidelines right now. I heard on one of the other panels this morning, for all real estate, $200 billion of dry powder for the real estate industry. Look, when you speak to the brokerage firms, they're all doing hundreds of BOVs for servicers, for lenders. But so far, we're not seeing that hurricane. We're not seeing, we're probably not even seeing a tropical storm. We're not even seeing a rain shower. I mean, right now, there's one project that we're working at. It's a bankruptcy sale, and we have people like, oh my God, there's a bankruptcy sale. This is distressed. I'm so excited. Look, I really think that lenders don't want to take back properties right now, and we'll talk about this later in our panel. They want to have conversations. They want to find a win-win solution. Even if lenders were to take back properties, they don't want to rush REO sales. It's the worst time to sell a hotel. So I think, if anything, and I'd love to see my distinguished friends here in the panel's view, but I think the best is going to be a tropical storm.
Russ, maybe you could talk about some of the dialogue you've been having with your lenders, balance sheet, CMBS. Tell us about how that's going, and what are you seeing?
For sure. Look, we went through last year, and did, modifications on, the overwhelming majority of our portfolio. And I would say the majority of the portfolio went through two modifications, maybe a third. And in general, particularly earlier last year, it was very smooth and simple. And the vast majority of the lenders, to Ed's point, didn't want to come, wouldn't touch our hotels with a 10-foot pole. And I honestly, the one or two that were more challenging, I think, required someone to blink, and the lenders would blink, because at the end of the day, when no one's caused it and you can't create demand, all you could say is, here's the situation on the ground, and our partners and our lenders have been great, and we put in a lot of money and got PPP loans and all the rest of it. I think a couple of takeaways that I'm having, especially as we turn the corner now. So a few things have happened. Now that we're turning the corner, we can all underwrite. We might disagree, but we can all underwrite a return of some sort this year. And so that tied to maturities has been the biggest issue. And I'd say if you were a borrower last year or this year, the number one thing you should be fighting for is extension, is time. And that's maybe the single most important thing that we want in every one of our loans. And the few places where, for a variety of reasons, we didn't need material modifications, we weren't putting in capital, whatever it was, and we have a couple of maturities later this year, that's a real focus. And because, and I'll wrap up here, you have this interesting dynamic now where lenders and borrowers can both see some type of recovery. We might disagree on what that exactly looks like. And you tie that to, a debt maturity, and suddenly you actually have a potential challenge that could yield. And if it's in my portfolio, I hate it. But if it's in your portfolio, maybe I'll buy it. Could yield some deal flow, I think, later this year.
Ronnie, do you want to weigh in on what you're hearing? Listen, a lot of these 180-day deferrals are, burning off as we speak. What happens next?
Yeah. So from our perspective, most of our lenders are balance sheet lenders. So going through the 180 days, we were in a good position for a couple of reasons. On one hand, we had folks that we knew we could pick up the phone and call, like we all know how that works, and that was very helpful. But on the other side, we had a very reasonable LTV as well on the portfolio, so we were able to carry through, not without pain. And now what we're seeing moving forward over the next 6 to 12 months is lenders are looking at extensions in a non-uniform way, right? So great borrowers with great assets would get a certain behavior, but bad borrower with bad assets on the other spectrum may require a bit of a heavier pay down. I think that's probably going to entice a little bit more transactions moving forward versus what we've seen before. But all in all, my opinion is that we haven't seen a lot of transactions because we had, a solid regulation framework that helped, smaller players not getting heavily absorbed by predatory behavior. And that's something that is positive and to celebrate in the environment that we went through. And it may not have benefit folks like us on the offensive side, and some other folks on the panel as well that were looking to buy distressed, but it's probably for the greater good.
Lucas, can you weigh in on hotel property values? I think it's fair to say that for all intents and purposes, they've declined, right? They're actually, that doesn't mean that a particular hotel's value has not moved sideways. There's actually a transaction that occurred in Pentagon City, outside of DC, in Amazon land, the Residence Inn there that, let's see, Host sold it to Blackstone a year ago for $99 million. At that point, HQ2 was fully baked. Everybody knew what was going to happen there. And then a year later, Blackstone sold it to Amazon for $148 million. So that was a $50 million or 50% increase in 1 year during a pandemic. Obviously, that's an outlier, but maybe you could talk about, what's going on with hotel valuations.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a wide distribution, distribution curve, right? So, but one of the good news of this, I think to answer this question is that we've seen several transactions in that post-COVID world. And again, there's a range, but I'd say generally speaking, those transactions have landed in a 20 to 30% decline range. So, I think several transactions within that band. And what's interesting, at Green Street, we like to look at to the public markets, look at the public markets telling us about the private markets. And oftentimes the public market actually looks ahead and kind of predicts what will happen in the private market. And there's some interesting things if you look there. So if you look to the hotel REITs and what they saw in March and April where they were priced, it kind of suggested that hotel values had declined somewhere in the order of 35 to 40% at that point if someone were to forced to sell a property at that given point in time. But since, especially after the vaccine news in November, we've definitely seen a rally in share prices. And the public market is much more optimistic about hotel values today. So that same number that was 35, 40% in March, April last year, today is something more like 10 to 15%. So even not only much better than what we saw last year, but ahead of where we saw transactions before the vaccine news. And so I think we still haven't seen enough transactions post the vaccine news. These things take time, and we'll certainly see those, I think, in the first half of this year. And I do think when we do see those comps, they'll point to values having moved up from kind of the transaction levels that we saw kind of in the back half of last year. So certainly the public market has become more optimistic. And there's obviously a lot of interesting questions there. I know we got a question in the Q&A panel about distress and whatnot. And I think that's a key thing that I've noticed is different this time around is, whatever it is, I think it's a combination of fiscal and monetary stimulus. But I don't think it's likely that we'll see as much distress as people may have thought maybe 6 to 9 months ago.
Russ, Ronnie, obviously you're dealing with existing assets and having to figure out hanging on, if you will. But I also know that you guys are out there looking at new opportunities, right? So talk a little bit about, how are you underwriting opportunities today? Ronnie, you want to go first?
Sure. So it's, there's two aspects to it. On one side, it's, underwriting opportunity is one thing, but you need a willing seller and an environment that is allowing sellers or somewhat forcing sellers to sell. And that environment, to Luca's point, is not there yet, and may not come for good assets, good borrowers. So we're not seeing a lot of transactions and happening, or at least anything that is enticing for us. But to Russ's point, we are in a much better position to take a point of view on recovery today than we were 6 months ago. And as part of the math equation of valuing a hotel, whether we're selling or buying, we need a point of view on recovery. So that's one thing. And to get a little bit more technical, you need perspective on what you would be buying at, and add a premium to that cap rate, because you're buying in the middle of a pandemic or recovering pandemic on a shutdown hotel, and the consequence of taking over an asset that has been not operating, and the cost implication of that. A third big piece to that valuation equation is, I mentioned a bit earlier on, and that everybody on the panel is familiar with, is the carry burden, right? So we need to take a point of view on that carry burden and factor in relationships that we may have and we may be able to add to a deal that we will acquire in order to do proper mods or or workouts with the existing lender or extensions possibly on maturity. So that's how we're looking at valuation right now. And all of that would solve into what our return expectations are for that deal.
Great. Actually, Lucas pointed out that there was and this is a good segue to the question that's out there. It says, the panel's optimism is wonderful, but do you think all property owners around the country have the liquidity to survive the long road to recovery? Ed, you want to tackle that?
Sure, I'm happy to, Dan. As I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, I head up with Mark LeBlanc, Ambridge Receivership Services. And so far, the majority of the assets that we've taken over as managers and receivers have been assets where the borrower has made a conscious decision. They said, look, we've looked at the numbers, we've analyzed what the profitability is, to Ronnie's point, what the carrying costs are for the next couple of years, what the debt coverage, forget the debt coverage, but even just the carrying costs from operations. And we made a conscientious decision to just hand back the keys. So I think that while the more well capitalized, and look, Lucas covers the public markets, one of the large REITs made a conscientious decision in the last couple of weeks to hand back a New York City asset to the lenders. So I think some of the less capitalized borrowers, and even some of the more well capitalized borrowers, are just going to make the decision on a one by one basis that the property just doesn't make sense with the carrying cost and the operating costs to maintain it. And no matter what your horizon is, and look, we're all bullish on this industry, but there is going to be it's a couple of years still before we turn back to a normal.
So this is, as I said early on, this is a New York focused conference. So let's talk a little bit about New York. I do find it amazing. I've been in this sector for quite some time, and New York was historically a high barrier to entry market, a darling market, if you will, for years and years and years. And today New York is probably at the bottom of the barrel, and just really a nasty word in connection with hotel investments. What do you see as Russ? What do you have any exposure in New York, Russ?
We've got a ground up project in Brooklyn right now.
Okay.
But I'll tell you, New York, and it's fascinating. I spoke with someone recently who, and we were talking about this, how in 2010, 11, 12, you could have almost thrown a dart, except if your dart hit Manhattan, and you might have been sorry you bought. And it's fascinating because, early cycle, by and large, you did well. It has been a real challenge, and it's been a challenge of supply. It's been a challenge of unions and other elements. So it is super challenging. And I think last cycle, to your point, Dan, people had so much memory of the 100 years beforehand that there were times, and we were caught in this, bidding in euphoria, saying, I don't quite know that the cap rate gets there, but man, it just seems cheap. And I think the best deals we did last cycle were ones where we got outbid by $5 on a hotel. There's several that we were in best and finals. And again, it was New York. So you were sending in a signed PSA, like, okay, I'll give you my deposit if you choose me, right? It was hot and heavy in some of these deals. And again, thank goodness we missed them, and that, just by dumb luck. And so it is, you've got several things going on. The union issue and union pension liability as some hotels shut forever, and what does that mean, and how does that play out? It's fascinating because I think the per pound has been challenged, and so I now say I don't know what that means. Unless it's land value, I don't know that means what it used to mean.
Right.
So,
yep.
It's challenging. It doesn't mean, listen, I'm the eternal optimist, so I wouldn't bet against New York 10 or 20 years from now, but I don't know how to buy, how to value, and put on paper and underwrite the right return.
Well, you talked about a dartboard earlier. Just take it out and use it again. I'd like to go around the horn because we only have a couple of minutes left and get everybody's take on New York. Lucas.
Stats about New York. So the 5 years before COVID hit, on average, a hotel probably saw about 15% cumulative NOI growth over that period. New York City was something more like down 45%. So a 60 percentage point gap between those two, right? That's just eye-opening, right? I mean, that's a downturn in most other parts, and we were in the upcycle. And that's supply induced. And that's the bad news. The good news, I think, is if you talk to industry participants, they expect supply to come off, right? Be converted to other use. As much as 20% of the market could be converted to other use. And if we do hit that number, I mean, that takes out a large part of that oversupply that the market's had to absorb over the last 10 plus years. So I think that's pointing to hopefully a more optimistic future than the last 10 years for New York City. Certainly it's going to take some time. There are a lot of near-term challenges. And I think another interesting wrinkle is the city's proposing some zoning changes that could make it harder to add new hotel supply to the market. That's still kind of in process. We'll see how that lands, and that's more of a longer term part of the equation. Again, in the short term, that's not going to matter much.
Yep.
But certainly
Great.
if that does happen, that'll be a longer term, I guess, benefit to current owners and not a benefit to developers.
Ronnie, real quick, give us your take on New York.
Well, we're deep on New York. We have 29 hotels here. We're not going anywhere. I think there'll be an adjustment period, but we're going to where we were before. I think supply is going to shrink, which will help adjust the recovery in favor of existing hotel owners and probably slow down a future supply because there's no to little new projects coming online. And lastly, to Luca's point on rezoning, that will allow to jumpstart negotiations with union. If you have the ability of converting your hotel to another use, then it's a complete different conversation with the existing system.
And the ultimate optimist, Ed.
I'm really glad that I now have a new name, the Ultimate Optimist. That went as opposed to my former name of Dr. Doom and Gloom. So, look, I think I've got a short-term view on New York and a long-term view. Right now, we have 16 hotels that we operate in New York City, of which 11 of them are closed. Short-term, I have a lot of concern. It's going to take a while. On the optimistic side, Dan, there was an article in one of the tourist magazines, the trade magazines, that the number one spot that people want to travel to internationally when the pandemic is over in the US is New York City. So you talk about the leisure transient business. The number one place in the US that the international travelers, which the borders will reopen, and again, people will be coming in, is New York. Number two, you've got 73 Fortune 500 companies based in New York. I know we've all heard about the occasional company moving to Palm Beach, moving somewhere else. They're not going to leave New York City. So again, we have a great demand in New York City for business transient. And last, where is better to hold the convention than New York City with all the demand generators? There's a starving for things like Broadway, for the arts, for et cetera, et cetera. And when that reopens sometime in 2021, I'll leave my ultimate optimist. Long-term, New York is in for a bright future. And as a buyer for guys like Russ and Ronnie, there will be some opportunities to make some good investments in New York because to the question from our audience, not everyone in New York will be able to hold on. So there'll be some opportunities to make some good investments.
Excellent. Do we have time? I think do we have time for one last question? The question is, doesn't this also depend on the ability, willingness of regulated banks and or lenders to stay with a borrower for the long term? Who wants to jump in on that one?
I'll tell you, if the dynamic here, which is ironic, is if you're going to have trouble making, if it's just interest carry that you're having trouble making, you might have trouble getting an extension. They may not want to stay with you. They might think they can actually cover this thing and actually get paid off. But if you're having trouble covering OpEx, which is the case of a lot of properties, and particularly Manhattan, the worse it is, the lenders are going to stay with you because what's their option? And so I think you're going to get that time. Some point during the ramp, you hit that inflection point where, the bank thinks, oh, I might be able to get out and you might not be ready. And so get extensions when you can.
Terrific. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me in what I think was a great, lively discussion. And I'm going to hand it back to the IMN folks.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks,
you. Dan. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I hope you all found the discussion to be of value. I certainly found that to be very meaningful and engaging. So thanks to our esteemed panelists for all of the work they put into this and for sharing with us their time and their expertise. So next on the agenda, in about 3 minutes here at 2:15 p.m. Eastern, we have a fireside chat with Francis Greenberger, Chairman and CEO of Time Equities, and hosted by Lisa Nee, partner with Eisner Amper. You can access the fireside chat through the agenda in Hub. Please also be sure to check out our sponsor booths in the virtual exhibit hall. We're confident that you'll find some products and services there, as well as make connections that could transform your business. Thanks so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today's virtual conference.